It was a rainy evening when Sister Margaret was last seen. The echoes of her prayers were the only sound that filled the old stone chapel as the storm raged outside. Locals remembered that haunting night like a shadow that never lifted. She wasn't just a nun. She was the heart of that small, forgotten monastery perched on the edge of the cliffs. Her kindness was legendary, her faith unshakable. Yet, on that cold night, after lighting the final candle and whispering her last hymn, she vanished. No footsteps in the mud, no trace in the forest. Nothing. Just gone, as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. For more than 2 decades, exactly 24 long years, her disappearance remained an agonizing mystery. Her face stayed on faded posters pinned to crumbling walls. Her name whispered in prayers by the elderly who still remembered. But time, cruel as it is, eventually reduced her story to little more than a ghost tale passed down in hushed voices. The police closed the case. Investigators moved on. But the monastery? It held its silence, as if guarding a secret too heavy for any living soul. Until one afternoon, when a carpenter, sent to renovate the crumbling basement of that same monastery, stumbled upon something so bizarre it sent shivers down his spine. Hidden behind a loose panel in the cellar wall was a small, dusty wooden box. Intricate, delicate, a music box, its surface carved with symbols long forgotten. The moment he wound it up, expecting the gentle sound of a lullaby, something else poured out. It wasn't music. It wasn't a melody. It was a voice. Her voice. Clear, trembling, but unmistakably real. The voice of Sister Margaret, praying, as if she was still there, as if she had never left. Those few seconds of audio unraveled every assumption made over those 24 silent years. Her words weren't random. They were precise, intentional. A plea, but to whom? And why, after all these years, would it be hidden inside a music box, buried behind a wall no one had touched in decades? Suddenly, what was once considered a simple disappearance started pointing to something far more disturbing and far more mysterious. And from that moment forward, the peaceful image of the monastery shattered. Secrets began to surface. Clues that had been ignored or buried started aligning in ways no one expected. What happened to Sister Margaret wasn't just a tragic accident. No, it was something orchestrated. Something that someone, maybe more than one person, desperately wanted to remain hidden forever. But now, the past had finally begun to speak, and its voice was hers. The carpenter's hands trembled as he stepped back, the chilling sound of the nun's voice still lingering in the air. It wasn't just the fact that the voice was clear, but it was how alive it sounded. Not like an old recording faded by time. No, her tone was desperate, yet composed, almost as if she was trapped somewhere, whispering through the walls, begging someone, anyone, to hear her. His instinct screamed at him to leave that basement, but something stronger held him in place. Curiosity, fear, or maybe fate? As the voice faded, the carpenter knelt beside the box again. He inspected it closely. The carvings weren't random. They were symbols, intricate and precise. Crosses intertwined with circles, eyes with tears, and what appeared to be a serpent coiled around an open book. None of it made sense. Yet, there was something disturbingly intentional about it. Whoever placed this music box here wanted it found, but only when the right person came along. Unable to resist, he carefully pried open the bottom of the box. Inside, he discovered an aged piece of parchment, brittle and yellowed with time. The ink was faded but legible. It wasn't a letter, nor confession. It was a map, or, at least, it looked like one. Lines drawn by hand, symbols matching those carved on the box, and a single phrase written in Latin. Vox mortui, vox veritatis. The voice of the dead is the voice of truth. His heart raced. What kind of truth was buried beneath this place? Haunted by the implications, he rushed upstairs to confront the monastery's caretaker, an elderly man named Father Samuel, who had overseen the grounds for more than 30 years. When presented with the music box, Father Samuel's face drained of all color. His hands clutched the crucifix around his neck, as if to shield himself from something unseen. "You shouldn't have opened it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Some doors are meant to stay closed." But the carpenter wasn't willing to let it go. He demanded answers. Why was Sister Margaret's voice inside a music box buried behind a wall? Where did the map lead to? And more importantly, why did Father Samuel look more terrified than surprised? After a long silence, the priest finally spoke, his voice trembling, because she never left. Her body was never found. And there are things beneath this monastery that were meant to stay hidden from the eyes of men. Father Samuel's eyes dart around the chapel as if invisible ears were listening. You don't understand, he said, his voice low and fragile. This place, this ground, holds secrets far older than any of us. Sister Margaret, she discovered something she shouldn't have. His fingers fidgeted nervously with his rosary beads, each word seeming heavier than the last. The carpenter felt the air thicken, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The old priest walked slowly toward the altar, his footsteps echoing in the empty sanctuary. He reached beneath a loose tile on the floor and pulled out an ancient, leather-bound book, its cover worn, its corners frayed, but its presence almost pulsating. She found this, he whispered. Or rather, this found her. The carpenter approached cautiously, noticing strange inscriptions on the cover, the same symbols from the music box. Opening the book revealed pages filled with handwritten notes, strange diagrams, and passages in languages the carpenter didn't recognize. But what stood out were the illustrations, detailed drawings of underground tunnels, cryptic altars, and something far more disturbing, a figure of a woman kneeling, surrounded by faceless shadows. Beneath it, the caption read, Custos Vocis, the keeper of the voice. His blood ran cold. Was this Sister Margaret? Father Samuel's voice broke the silence. Decades ago, Margaret became obsessed with the idea that something was wrong beneath this monastery. She heard things, voices in the walls, footsteps where no one walked. At first, we thought it was her imagination. But then, others began hearing it too. And one by one, those who tried to investigate disappeared. His hand trembled as he closed the book. She wasn't the first, and God forgive me, she won't be the last. The carpenter felt an icy chill crawling up his spine. It was no longer just about a missing nun. This was something far darker, something ancient, something that had been buried, not just physically, but intentionally, for generations. And now, with the music box uncovered, and the book open once again, whatever was hidden was stirring, waiting, watching. And the question that gnawed at him was no longer what happened to Sister Margaret, but rather, what did Sister Margaret find? The carpenter stood frozen, his mind racing, torn between leaving that cursed place and uncovering the truth that now clung to him like a shadow. Father Samuel sat down heavily on one of the old wooden pews, as if the weight of the years and the secrets he carried were suddenly too much to bear. There is something you must understand, the priest began, his voice barely above a whisper. This monastery was built not just for prayer, but as a seal for something we were never meant to confront. His words hung in the air like fog. What do you mean a seal? The carpenter asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. The priest closed his eyes, breathing deeply. Beneath the chapel, deeper than the cellar you were working in, there is an entrance that leads to a network of tunnels. Tunnels carved centuries ago by those who believed they could silence the unspeakable. His fingers tightened around the rosary, knuckles turning white. The carpenter felt a cold sweat forming on his skin. Every instinct told him to run. Yet, a strange force, maybe curiosity, maybe destiny, kept him rooted. And Sister Margaret, she went down there, he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Father Samuel nodded slowly. She was convinced the voices were cries for help. But when she descended, she realized they weren't calling for salvation. They were warning or luring. The priest rose, walking toward the old stained glass windows, the colored light reflecting on his face, making him look both holy and haunted. That night, when she vanished, we heard it, he whispered, a sound not human, not of this world. Her scream, then silence, deafening silence. We searched, God knows we searched, but all we found was a rosary, lying at the entrance to the lower tunnels. As the words sank in, a deafening silence filled the chapel. The carpenter's hands trembled, but deep within, a fire began to grow. The fear was real. The danger was real. But the need to know, to understand, had now surpassed it. "Show me," he demanded, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped his chest. "Show me where the tunnels are." Father Samuel's gaze darkened. He hesitated for several seconds that felt like an eternity, then finally nodded. "Follow me. But know this," he warned, "once we step beyond that door, there is no unseeing, no unknowing." He opened a narrow wooden door hidden behind the altar, so perfectly blended with the paneling that it was invisible to any outsider. A narrow stone staircase spiraled downward into the dark belly of the earth, cold air seeping upward as if the ground itself breathed. With each step, the dim light of the chapel faded, replaced by the suffocating blackness of the underground. The walls were damp, covered in moss, and the air grew heavier, saturated with a scent of earth, decay, and something metallic, like old blood. The carpenter's footsteps echoed alongside the priest's, the sound bouncing eerily off the narrow walls, as if someone, or something, was walking just behind them, but out of sight. They reached a heavy iron gate, rusted but solid. On it, the same strange symbols from the music box were engraved, their edges sharp and deep, as if they were carved not by tools, but by something with claws. Father Samuel fumbled with a ring of old keys, his hands shaking more with each passing second. "This gate hasn't been opened in over 20 years, he muttered. "Not since that night." With a grinding screech, the gate finally opened. A blast of icy air hit them, along with a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, of whispering. But it wasn't the whisper of wind. These were words. Words in a language the carpenter didn't understand, but his bones did. His body reacted before his mind could process it. Skin crawling, heart pounding, instinct screaming. Something was alive down there. Something that remembered. As they stepped inside, the narrow passage opened into a cavernous chamber. The walls were lined with shelves of bones, human bones, arranged meticulously, almost ritualistically. In the center of the chamber stood an ancient stone pedestal, and on it another box, identical to the one the carpenter had found. Only this one was open, and from it, a voice echoed through the darkness, a voice that made the carpenter's blood freeze. It was Sister Margaret, but this time she wasn't praying. She was laughing. The laughter echoed unnaturally, bouncing from wall to wall, twisting into something that sounded both human and utterly wrong. It was fragmented, broken, shifting tones between sorrow and malice, as if her voice had been shattered into pieces and stitched back together by something that had never known kindness. The carpenter stumbled backward, instinctively covering his ears, but the sound was inside him, not in the air, but in his very bones. Father Samuel dropped to his knees, muttering prayers that trembled off his lips, his rosary rattling violently between his fingers. Then, as suddenly as it started, the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the sound, leaving behind a void. But within that silence, there was movement, a slow, dragging sound, a shuffle of something, someone, just beyond the veil of shadows that surrounded the chamber. The carpenter strained his eyes, but saw nothing. Yet, his gut screamed they were no longer alone. The priest's breathing grew labored. "We shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. "We should have left it sealed. We should have never." But his words trailed off as something caught his attention. At the far end of the chamber, where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick, a doorway revealed itself. Not carved by human hands, but fractured into the stone as though the earth itself had split open. Drawn by a force he couldn't understand, the carpenter approached. On the archway were the same Latin words from the parchment, Vox mortui, Vox veritatis. Beneath it, smeared in what looked disturbingly like dried blood, was a symbol, an open eye pierced by a dagger. The closer he got, the colder it became. His breath now visible in front of him, despite being deep underground where no frost should exist. From the darkness of the doorway, a voice called out, a whisper. But this time, it wasn't Sister Margaret. It was deeper, older, malevolent. "Why did you come?" it asked. The voice wasn't heard. It was felt, in his spine, in his teeth, in his blood. The carpenter froze, realizing Whatever was behind that door was awake, and it had been waiting. Father Samuel grabbed the carpenter's arm with a strength that belied his frail frame. "No further," he hissed, eyes wide with terror. "Beyond that door is not meant for the living." But the carpenter couldn't pull away his gaze. Something inside that void pulled at him, not with malice, but with the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. His mind raced back to the voice in the music box. The prayer, the plea, the laughter. How were they connected? Was Sister Margaret still, somehow, in there? The priest's grip faltered as a sound emerged from the doorway. The soft, rhythmic hum of chanting. Not voices in harmony, but discordant, overlapping, as if multiple tongues were speaking different languages at once, forming a sound that wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. The carpenter's knees buckled, his body instinctively rejecting the frequency, yet his curiosity, or perhaps madness, forced him to remain standing. Suddenly, a gust of freezing wind surged from the doorway, extinguishing the lantern Father Samuel held. Darkness swallowed them whole. In that pitch black, shapes began to form, not with light, but with absence, darker than the darkness itself. Silhouettes tall, thin, with limbs that bend in unnatural ways. Their presence didn't make sound. It canceled it. No footsteps, no breathing, just the oppressive sensation of being surrounded by watchers. The chanting grew louder, until it became unbearable, not in volume, but in pressure. The carpenter felt as if his skull would crack. And then, silence. A single voice broke through. This time, it was unmistakably Sister Margaret. Soft, gentle, yet filled with unspeakable sadness. "Leave," she whispered, "before it sees you." A sudden crash echoed behind them. The iron gate, the one they'd entered through, had slammed shut on its own. Father Samuel scrambled toward it, pounding with his fists, shouting prayers, but the gate wouldn't budge. The realization dawned on them both, cold and suffocating. They weren't just visitors here anymore. They were prisoners, and whatever lived beyond that door was no longer just watching. It was moving. The air turned impossibly cold, so cold that each breath felt like shards of glass scraping down their throats. Father Samuel frantically continued, trying to force the iron gate open, his knuckles bleeding from the effort. But the carpenter didn't move. His eyes were locked on the dark archway, where the last echo of Sister Margaret's voice still seemed to linger like smoke. Something about her words. "Before it sees you." But what was it? And why, after 24 years, was her voice still here, trapped between worlds? A sudden flash of movement drew his attention. In the corner of his vision, just for a second, a figure, a silhouette, small, frail, kneeling. He whipped his head around, and there, at the far end of the chamber, illuminated by nothing but the oppressive glow of the dark itself, was her, or what looked like her, Sister Margaret, dressed in her habit, head bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. But something was wrong. Her figure flickered, distorted, like a reflection in broken glass. "Margaret," the carpenter whispered before realizing he hadn't meant to speak at all. The name escaped like an involuntary breath, and as if the sound was a trigger, her head turned. Slowly, mechanically, her face remained hidden beneath the shadow of her veil, but two hollow voids where eyes should have been stared directly at him. And then a smile. Thin, crooked, unnatural. The kind of smile that didn't come from joy, but from knowing something terrible. Father Samuel collapsed to the ground, his body trembling uncontrollably, murmuring prayers now mixed with sobs. She's not her," he gasped. "She's a vessel now." But the carpenter couldn't look away. His legs refused to obey. From somewhere deep within the shadows, that voice returned, the one from before. Male, hollow. The voice was never hers. "The voice is ours." Then, slowly, Sister Margaret, or whatever was left of her, rose to her feet. Her movements were jagged, as though her bones didn't quite remember how to function. She extended a hand forward, and with it came a sound, like 1,000 whispering mouths breathing into the ears of the living. The walls trembled, the bones on the shelves rattled, and from behind the shadows, something massive, something ancient, began to stir. A deep rumble echoed through the ground, vibrating their feet, as cracks began to snake across the stone floor beneath them. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed to shift, pulsating like a living thing, expanding and contracting as if it were breathing. The carpenter could feel it, not just hear it, as if the vibrations were crawling beneath his skin, threading through his veins. And then, slowly, a form began to emerge. Not entirely visible, not entirely real. A presence made of absence, darker than any shadow, heavier than any silence. Father Samuel scrambled backward, pressing his back against the wall, gripping his crucifix so tightly it left deep marks in his skin. "It's the Watcher," he stammered, his voice hoarse with terror. "The one beneath. The one they tried to seal away. The one that was never meant to have a name." His eyes darted toward the carpenter. She called it. She brought it forth. And now, it remembers the taste of the living. The presence unfolded, towering, formless, yet impossibly vast. Its outline was stitched together by strands of shadow, each one pulsating with symbols, the same symbols from the music box, the same ones carved on the gate, now glowing faintly like dying embers. Within its mass, eyes opened. Not 2, not 10, hundreds, thousands, each blinking asynchronously, watching, searching, choosing. And then a mouth formed, a jagged slit across the void, opening not to speak, but to breathe. A breath so deep it felt as though it was trying to inhale the very souls of everyone present. Sister Margaret's figure remained standing, but now she was shaking violently, her hands clenched into fists, as if struggling against something, or someone, inside her own body. Her voice trembled, half hers, half something else. "You shouldn't have come," she rasped. And then her body convulsed, falling to her knees, both hands clawing at her face, as though trying to tear something out from within herself. The Watcher shifted again. Its eyes locked onto the carpenter. A wave of nausea, dizziness, and unspeakable dread washed over him. His vision blurred, and his ears rang with frequencies no human should ever hear. And then, the voice spoke once more. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command, a declaration. One came before. One stayed. Now 2 remain. And with that, the chamber shook violently, as if the earth itself was trying to reject what had just been said, but it was already too late. The carpenter fell to his knees as the overwhelming pressure forced every muscle in his body to seize. His vision warped. The walls seemed to bend inward, the ceiling stretched impossibly high, and the floor beneath him pulsed like a living thing. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but there was no direction that led to safety. There was no escape. He was inside something older than time, something that didn't recognize life as anything more than a fleeting inconvenience. Father Samuel curled into himself, his hands covering his ears, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers that sounded hollow against the oppressive chorus of whispers now swirling through the chamber. The Watcher loomed closer, not by moving, but by becoming. Its mass seemed to devour the space itself, folding reality inward, until the room felt as though it existed within a heartbeat that didn't belong to any living creature. Sister Margaret's body twitched violently on the floor. Her hands gripped the stone so tightly her nails snapped off against it. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came. Only a deep, guttural hum vibrated from her throat, as though something beneath her voice was trying to claw its way out. Her head jerked up, and the veil slipped from her face, revealing sunken, hollow eyes, empty, yet staring into something only she could see. And then, from the shadows behind the Watcher, movement. Dozens, no, hundreds of smaller shapes began to emerge. Crawling, slithering. Figures with human silhouettes, but with limbs too long, necks too thin, jaws that stretched unnaturally wide. They surrounded the chamber, forming a living wall of distorted flesh and shadow. Their eyes gleamed with a hunger not for food, but for memories for existence. These were the taken, those who had ventured here before, those who never left. The carpenter's heart thundered, each beat feeling like it might tear his chest apart. Somewhere, beneath the suffocating terror, a question burned through the fog of panic. Is this what happened to her? Is this what she became? But before the thought could fully form, the Watcher spoke again, this time not through words, but through a vibration so deep it rattled his teeth. The voice is the key. The voice is the door. The voice is the offering. And as the meaning settled in, the carpenter realized with horror, the music box hadn't been a warning. It had been an invitation. The walls trembled as cracks split the stone, sending shards cascading to the floor like broken glass. Father Samuel screamed, not from pain, but from something deeper, a realization that whatever ancient protection had kept this place sealed for so long was failing. His hands clutched at his chest as he gasped, the seal is breaking. Oh God, it's breaking. The Watcher tilted its form, if something that vast could be said to tilt. The thousands of eyes blinked in a cascade of chaos, focusing, narrowing, on the carpenter. And then, slowly, the Watcher began to retract, folding backward, pulling itself into the doorway of shadows from which it had emerged. But it wasn't retreating. No, it was making room. Something else was coming. Something worse. Something that needed more space. From the far end of the cavern, another sound rose. Not a whisper, not a chant. It was a scream, high-pitched, distant, yet near. A scream of something being born, or perhaps unleashed. The air grew heavier. The walls bowed inward. The ground split further, revealing beneath the floor a pit that seemed to have no bottom. Only more darkness, more void, more hunger. Sister Margaret's body began levitating, her limbs rigid, her fingers clawed toward the sky. Her mouth stretched, open unnaturally wide as the same scream poured from her. But it wasn't hers. It was something else. Her body jerked, twisted, contorted, as black tendrils of shadow poured from her chest. Her eyes, her mouth, forming symbols in the air, glyphs that rotated and pulsed like living things. The Watcher's mass shuddered in response, as though even it recognized that what was happening wasn't entirely under its control. Then silence. A terrifying, suffocating silence. The shadows froze. The figures of the taken ceased their twitching, their jaws still hanging open. Even the Watcher itself recoiled slightly. And in that silence a voice. Not loud, not deep, not distorted. Pure, feminine, childlike. You heard it. You followed it. You opened the door. Now, it's your turn to sing. And with those words, the music box in the carpenter's pocket began to turn, slowly, on its own, the handle spinning with a soft metallic click, click, click before a melody, sweet and innocent, filled the void. The melody that drifted from the music box was hauntingly beautiful, a child's lullaby, delicate and fragile, yet impossibly out of place in the monstrous void that now surrounded them. Each note echoed longer than it should, bending unnaturally, as though the air itself resisted carrying it. The carpenter's hands shook uncontrollably as he reached into his pocket, feeling the small, cold weight of the box as it continued to turn on its own. Father Samuel whimpered, shrinking further against the stone wall, his face buried in his trembling hands. No, no, not the song. Not again, he muttered, his voice hollow, like a man reliving the worst moment of his life. His words made no sense, until the realization struck. This wasn't the first time the song had played. This wasn't the first time the door had opened. This had happened before. The figures of the taken stood motionless, heads tilted as if mesmerized by the melody, their hollow eyes glistening with something that resembled memory, or perhaps longing. Their chests rose and fell, not in breathing, but in synchronization with the rhythm of the music. The glyphs floating in the air pulsed to the same tempo, dimming and flaring like a heartbeat woven into the very fabric of the darkness. The Watcher itself trembled, retreating further into the doorway, folding into its own mass as though shrinking from the sound. But it wasn't fear. No, it was reverence, obedience, submission. The melody commanded. And then, slowly, the ground began to fracture, deep fissures opening into the abyss below. From within them, voices. Countless voices, crying, singing, screaming, all layered beneath the innocent tune of the music box, creating a chorus of madness that threatened to shatter the carpenter's mind. As the song reached its peak, A high, trembling note. The shadowy tendrils surrounding Sister Margaret coiled tighter, pulling her body upright, as if she were a puppet dangling on invisible strings. Her eyes flickered. Something behind them. Someone was fighting. Her mouth trembled, trying to form words. And when her lips parted, her real voice, fragile, broken, human, slipped out. "It's not too late, but you must, close." But before she could finish, her body convulsed violently, and her voice was drowned by the deafening crescendo of the music box. The crescendo fractured the very air. Dust fell from the ceiling as stones cracked and split. The carpenter fell backward, his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him now, vibrating through bone, sinew, and thought. Father Samuel collapsed fully to the ground, unconscious or dead. It was impossible to tell. The taken twisted their heads in unison toward the source of the melody, their limbs jerking in grotesque mimicry of something trying to remember how to move. Then an explosion of silence. Not a fade, not a stop, a sudden, violent absence. The music box's lid snapped shut on its own, and every single sound vanished in an instant. No breathing, no whisper, no tremor. Even the oppressive hum of the void disappeared. For a heartbeat, or perhaps a lifetime, there was only nothingness. And then a voice, gentle, clear, terrifying in its simplicity. Choose. It didn't come from the watcher. It didn't come from Sister Margaret. It came from everywhere. From the walls, the air, the very marrow of the carpenter's bones. A word that weighed heavier than any scream. Choose. But choose what? A soft light flickered at the far end of the chamber. A doorway. Wooden. Ordinary. Out of place. A simple cellar door, like one might find in any home. It hadn't been there before. On its surface, two symbols. On the left, an open eye. On the right, a closed one. Beneath them, the same Latin words. Vox mortui, vox veritatis. The voice of the dead is the voice of truth. As the carpenter rose to his feet, staggering toward it, Sister Margaret's body collapsed, the tendrils withdrawing back into the cracks of the earth. Her chest heaved once, twice, still alive. Barely. Her hand weakly extended toward him as her lips moved, forming a single word that trembled on the edge of sound. Wrong. Choice. But which door? Which symbol? And what exactly was the cost of being wrong? The carpenter's breathing became shallow, ragged, as the reality of the choice before him pressed in from every direction. The door stood silently, waiting, as though time itself had paused to witness his decision. On one side, the open eye, watching, unblinking cold. On the other, the closed eye, sealed, hidden, silent. His hands trembled. Somewhere deep in his chest, his heartbeat pounded so violently it felt like it might rupture his ribs. Behind him, the watcher stirred again, its countless eyes flickering in a wave, like a sea of blinking stars swallowed by shadow. It wasn't advancing. Not yet, but its presence pressed into him like an invisible wall, a reminder that time was running out. The taken stood perfectly still, their hollow gazes fixed on him, their heads slightly tilted, as if they too were waiting, eager, curious to see which path he would choose. Sister Margaret coughed weakly, a rattle in her chest betraying how close she was to the edge of death, or something far worse. Her hand dragged feebly across the stone floor, her fingertips etching faint lines into the dust, reaching toward him but never quite making contact. Her lips trembled, her voice cracking. It lies, both are, but the words dissolved into wet, broken gasps. A sharp, sudden pulse of pressure slammed against his skull, like a migraine detonating behind his eyes. The voice again, clearer, louder, closer. Choose, choose, choose. Repeating now, faster, rhythmic, pounding in sync with his own heartbeat. His vision blurred, the edges of the room warped, bending inward, as if the space itself was collapsing in on the gravity of his indecision. His trembling fingers hovered between the two symbols. Open eye or closed eye, revelation or ignorance, exposure or concealment, salvation or damnation. But the cruel truth was, he didn't know which was which. There were no hints, no clues, no guarantees, only the agonizing certainty that one path would lead deeper into horror, and the other might be even worse. A deep groan rumbled from the earth beneath him, as if the monastery's very foundations were warning him that the moment of decision could not be delayed any longer. The ground trembled. Small stones rattled. Fissures spiderwebbed out from beneath his feet. Behind him, the watcher's eyes dilated in anticipation, and the taken began to twitch, their fingers flexing, their mouths opening just enough to reveal rows of impossibly sharp, mismatched teeth. With a cry that was equal parts fear and defiance, the carpenter lunged forward and pressed his palm against the symbol of the closed eye. The moment his skin touched the cold wood, a shock wave of energy exploded outward, slamming him back onto the stone floor. The door didn't open. It disappeared, collapsing into itself like smoke being sucked into a vacuum. But what stood behind it was worse than anything he could have imagined. No passage, no tunnel. Instead, a mirror. Tall, cracked, framed in ancient iron, twisted with symbols of eyes and mouths stitched shut. And in that mirror, not his reflection, not entirely. It was him, but hollow, paler, thinner. And his reflection was smiling. A wide, cruel smile that didn't match the terror on his real face. The mirror version of himself raised a finger to its lips in a gesture of silence, then slowly pointed behind him. The carpenter turned, dread blooming like ice in his chest. And there, Sister Margaret was no longer on the floor. She was standing, tall, straight, but wrong. Her mouth was sewn shut with thick, black thread, her eyes both sewn closed. Her hands dangled by her sides, twitching, her head tilted as though listening to something only she could hear. A sudden, suffocating realization crushed him. The closed eye didn't mean safety. It meant blindness, silence, obedience. It was not the path to escape. It was the path to becoming one of them, one of the taken. And as the mirror version of himself stepped forward, grinning, reaching out, the carpenter understood the truth too late. The door hadn't asked which path led out. It had asked, which version of hell did he prefer? The mirror version of himself moved closer, its movements fluid but wrong, limbs bending at just slightly the wrong angles, neck tilting too far, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Its smile never wavered, stretching impossibly wide, revealing teeth that weren't his. Too many, too sharp, too hungry. The carpenter scrambled backward, his hands scraping against the stone floor, searching desperately for anything at all, that could anchor him to reality. Behind him, Sister Margaret's form began to glide forward. Her sewn-shut eyes didn't prevent her from knowing exactly where he was. Each step echoed unnaturally loud, the sound warped, as though time itself was struggling to process her presence. Her hands reached out, trembling, fingers twitching, not as though she wanted to grab him, but as if something inside her needed him. The watcher's presence swelled once again. It hadn't disappeared. It had simply waited. And now, as the mirror version advanced, it unfolded from the doorway, spreading its mass across the walls, ceiling, and floor like a living infection, its eyes blinking in chaotic patterns, watching everything, not as a threat, but as an audience to a ritual it had witnessed countless times before. The taken began to move, slowly at first, their necks craned unnaturally, some rotating more than any human anatomy should allow. Their jaws slackened open as discordant whispers spilled from their mouths, fragments of words, broken prayers, shattered memories of lives they no longer remembered. And among those voices were new ones, recent ones, a child crying, a woman begging, a man pleading, all overlapping, all trapped. And then the mirror version of the carpenter spoke, but not with his voice. It was a chorus, hundreds of voices layered into one. There was never a choice, only the illusion of it. You were summoned, as all are summoned. You heard the voice. You opened the door. And now, you must take your place. As it spoke, its shadow detached from its feet, stretching, growing, twisting into a grotesque silhouette that began slithering toward him like a living thing. The carpenter lunged to his feet, adrenaline overriding every instinct screaming for him to collapse. His eyes darted around the chamber, searching for anything, an exit, a weakness, something out of place. And then, he saw it. A crack, Small, almost imperceptible, running along the frame of the mirror. It wasn't much, but it was something. A flaw, a fracture in whatever this nightmare was. Sister Margaret's sewn-shut face twitched violently, as if sensing what he'd noticed. Her head snapped toward the mirror, and a muffled, strangled sound gurgled from behind the thick black thread sealing her mouth. Her hands clenched into fists, her entire body shaking, trembling, convulsing as if part of her, the part that was still her, was fighting. Fighting it. The mirror version lunged, its hand extended, fingers stretching, splitting at the tips into sharp, needle-like points. But the carpenter didn't hesitate. He grabbed a loose shard of stone from the floor and, with every ounce of strength, hurled it at the crack in the mirror. The impact wasn't dramatic. No explosion of glass, no shattering sound, but the crack deepened. The mirror pulsed, and for the first time, the watcher recoiled. A howl erupted, not from a mouth, not from throat, but from everywhere. The walls vibrated violently, the floor trembled, and the taken shrieked in unison, their bodies convulsing, their limbs snapping into unnatural shapes. The shadow spilling from the mirror version flared wildly, writhing like it had been set on fire, retreating, clawing at the ground as if trying to bury itself back into the earth. Seizing the moment, the carpenter lunged forward. He slammed his fists against the crack again, and again, and again. With each blow, the mirror flickered, the false version of himself spasming, its grin faltering, its body glitching, distorting, folding in on itself. Behind him, Sister Margaret dropped to her knees, her hands clutching her face, shaking violently, and from between the stitches a sound. A voice. Her real voice. Break it, break the voice, break the lie. The mirror groaned as fractures spread like lightning bolts across its surface. Each crack unleashed a ripple through the air, distorting reality. The walls bowed inward, the ceiling rippled like water, and the ground beneath trembled as though some enormous, buried thing stirred with every impact. The reflection of the carpenter screamed, but the scream didn't come from its mouth. It erupted from the cracks themselves, as though the mirror was trying to hold in 1,000 trapped souls. The shadow twin writhed, its limbs bending and splintering as it fought to hold form. Its grin collapsed into a snarl of panic, its hands clawing at the air, as if trying to pull itself back into the glass. The watcher's mask flared in response, its thousands of eyes snapping shut all at once, as if the act of witnessing this fracture was forbidden, unbearable, or perhaps dangerous even for it. Sister Margaret trembled on the floor, her hands clawing at her stitched mouth, blood oozing between her fingers as she desperately tugged at the threads. The carpenter could hear her ragged breathing, hear the suffocating desperation in her struggle. She wasn't just fighting the stitches. She was fighting it, the thing that had silenced her, the thing that had used her voice as bait. Another crack, another pulse. The taken shrieked in chaos, their forms glitching violently, flickering between shadow and bone, between memory and flesh. Some dropped to the ground, convulsing, while others simply collapsed inward, folding into themselves as though their very existence had been built on the lie the mirror sustained. Without it, they couldn't hold form. With a final, guttural roar, the carpenter grabbed a heavier stone, larger, sharper, and hurled it with everything he had left. The mirror shattered, not like glass, not like any material of this world. It broke like a scream breaks into silence, violently, abruptly, absolutely. A burst of light exploded from the fracture, so bright it was colorless, blinding, filling every corner of the chamber. And within that light, the voices, screaming, pleading, singing, all at once. And then, silence. As the light receded, the chamber changed. The oppressive shadows evaporated like smoke under sunlight. The walls, once pulsing with living veins of shadow, now stood as bare, cold stone. The watcher, that towering, formless mass of eyes and mouths, was gone. No trace of it, not even dust. Only the memory of its presence lingered, thick in the air, like the aftermath of a nightmare you can't quite shake. The taken were gone too. Where they had stood, where their twisted forms had shivered in anticipation of consuming, there was nothing now but piles of dust. Ash, as though their existence had never been real at all. Or perhaps it had only ever been borrowed, sustained by the lie, by the voice, by the mirror. The carpenter stood in the center of it all, his chest heaving, legs trembling, hands bloodied from stone and splinters. His ears rang with the ghost of the melody from the music box, though no sound played now. Just the phantom echo, buried deep in his mind. His eyes darted across the space, searching, hoping, terrified of what he might, or might not, find. And then a sound. A wet, gasping sob. He spun around. There. Sister Margaret. Collapsed. But different. Her veil was gone. Her face pale, hollow, age beyond years. But her mouth, the threads were gone. Torn. Bloodied. Her lips trembled as she coughed, struggling to breathe, as though the very act of existing outside the grip of that shadow was an unbearable effort. Her eyes, sunken but open, met his, and for the first time, they were hers. No longer hollow, no longer filled with borrowed shadows. Just pain, just exhaustion, just her. And with a shaking hand, she reached toward him, her voice a fragile whisper barely stronger than a breath. It's not over. Her gaze drifted past him, widening in horror as her trembling lips mouthed a word that made his blood run cold. Behind you. A chill unlike anything he had felt before crawled up his spine. His body locked in place, paralyzed between the instinct to turn and the primal terror of what he might see. His breathing grew shallow, shaky. For a moment, the entire chamber felt impossibly still, not silent, but waiting, as though the very air was holding its breath alongside him. Sister Margaret's hollow whisper lingered in his mind, echoing over and over. Behind you. Against every shred of instinct, the carpenter turned his head, slowly, painfully, and there, standing no more than a breath away, was the mirror. Whole, pristine, not cracked, not broken, no signs of damage, as if it had never shattered at all. And within its surface, not his reflection, not anymore. Instead, a door, a familiar door, the one from before, the door with the two symbols. But this time, both symbols were closed eyes. And then, the handle turned. Slowly. Smoothly. Not from his hand. Not from anyone's hand. The door within the mirror creaked open, revealing nothing but an infinite black void, darker than anything he'd seen in the chamber, darker than the Watcher itself. A darkness that wasn't just the absence of light, but the consumption of it. A darkness that felt hungry. From within that void, a shape emerged. First fingers. Thin, elongated, far too long. Then hands, pale, almost translucent. And then a face, human, but impossibly smooth, devoid of any defining features. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just skin stretched over bone. Featureless, until it began to form. Slowly, a mouth tore open where there was none. Then two deep sockets caved into the skull, becoming eyes. And within those hollow voids, something watched. Something ancient. Something smiling. A voice seeped out of the void. Not spoken. Not heard. But felt. In his teeth. In his bones. In his mind. You broke the lie, but you never closed the door. And now, something must take its place. The hands extended further, reaching toward him. Not to harm. Not to pull him in. But to offer something. A box. Small. Wooden. Familiar. Identical to the music box he had found, but newer, polished, as if freshly made, and upon it, a single phrase burned into the wood. Vox mortui, vox veritatis. The carpenter stared at the box, frozen between dread and disbelief. His fingers trembled as he slowly reached forward, though every fiber of his being screamed against it. The hands, impossibly still, impossibly patient, held the box with a reverence that made his stomach knot. It wasn't just an object. It was a contract, a curse, a key. His palm brushed against the polished wood, and the temperature around him plummeted. The moment his skin touched it, the void behind the figure shuddered. Not with rage, but with anticipation. The hands withdrew back into the darkness, folding inward, vanishing without a sound. The door in the mirror slowly swung shut on its own. The symbols of the closed eyes glowed faintly, then dimmed, then disappeared completely. And the mirror? It remained, ominously still, silent, waiting. The box in his hands vibrated. Once, twice, a slow, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat. Sister Margaret gasped behind him, her broken voice cracking through the suffocating tension. You shouldn't have. You don't understand. Her hands clawed weakly at the floor as if trying to drag herself away. Not from the box. From him. Her eyes filled with a horror deeper than anything she had shown before. And then, the lid clicked open. Slowly. Methodically. Inside, there was no mechanism. No gears. No winding handle. Only darkness. A bottomless, swallowing black. But from that darkness, a voice. A whisper. A child's whisper. Sing for me, sweet. Innocent. Terrifying. The melody began, not from the box, but from the very walls. From the stones. From the bones buried beneath. A nursery rhyme in a language no human had ever spoken, but one every soul seemed to know instinctively. A song older than memory itself. The ground trembled. The air thickened. Sister Margaret's scream ripped through the chamber as her body convulsed once more. Her hands covered her ears, her mouth open in a voiceless cry. The shadows that had once vanished began to return, slowly, silently, as if drawn back to a flame that had never truly died. And in the center of it all, the carpenter stood, music box in hand, the new voice, the new keeper, the new door. The melody intensified, folding in on itself, twisting between sweetness and discord. Notes stretched and bent in ways that defied the natural order of sound, creating something not entirely music, but not entirely noise either. The carpenter tried to drop the box, but his hands wouldn't obey. His fingers locked around it as though fused to the wood, tendons tightening, muscles cramping, as if the box now possessed him. Sister Margaret dragged herself backward, her wide, terrified eyes reflecting something the carpenter couldn't yet see. Something standing behind him, something rising from the cracks in the floor, fed by the song, born from the echoes of every shattered voice that had ever been trapped within these walls. Her voice trembled as she sobbed. You don't understand, it's not just a box, it's a mouth. The floor beneath him fractured, sending tremors through the entire chamber. From the splits in the stone, tendrils of shadow slithered upward, not aggressively, but hungrily, curling toward the music box like plants toward sunlight. The walls pulsed, breathing. The air thickened with the copper sting of blood and something else, something older, metallic, sour like rotting memory. And then it spoke again, the voice from the box, soft, playful, mocking. Sing, or be silent forever. As it whispered, the shadow tendrils surged upward, wrapping around his arms, his legs, his waist, not pulling him down, but binding him upright, holding him like a marionette. The weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressed into his skin. He could feel them, watching, waiting, demanding. The melody shifted. Now, layered beneath it, a rhythm, a pulse like a heartbeat, but deeper, heavier, as though the earth itself were joining the song. And within that rhythm, footsteps, slow, deliberate, growing louder, closer. From the far end of the chamber, a figure began to take shape. Not shadow, not flesh, something between, draped in fabric that shimmered like liquid darkness, moving with a grace that made the air around it shiver. The figure stepped forward. Its presence was suffocating, its silhouette constantly shifting, sometimes tall and gaunt, sometimes short and hunched, as if reality itself couldn't decide what shape it should hold. Where a face should have been, there's only a void, a hole in the world, a negative space that pulled at the edges of everything around it. And yet it smiled, without a mouth, without a face. It smiled. Sister Margaret's hands clawed at the floor, her nails cracking against stone as she pulled herself farther away. No, not again, not another, please. Her voice was broken, a raw plea that vibrated with the knowledge of exactly what was unfolding. She had seen this before. She had been this before. And now, it was happening again. The figure glided toward the carpenter, the shadows recoiling and bending as it passed. It extended a hand, thin, skeletal, the bones beneath the skin outlined as though the flesh were just an afterthought. In its palm, another music box. Smaller, cruder, cracked, old, its surface etched with names. Hundreds of names. Some faded, some fresh, some still being written, the letters carving themselves into the wood, bleeding ink that dripped like tears. The voice came again, not from the figure, not from the box, from everything, from the walls, the air, the marrow of his bones. The voice does not belong to one, but to many. Each carries it, until they are full. Then another must take it. The figure's fingers curled, gently presenting the older box. A choice, but not really a choice at all. A cycle, a ritual, a curse wrapped in the skin of a song. The carpenter stared, horror rising like bile in his throat. His hands trembled around the newer box, already fused to his palms. And in that moment, understanding dawned. The watcher hadn't disappeared. The taken hadn't vanished. They had simply been absorbed, folded into the voice, into the song, into the endless machinery of suffering disguised as melody. And now it was his turn to decide, to carry it, or to be consumed by it. The air grew heavier, compressing around the carpenter's lungs, as if even the simple act of breathing now required permission from something far beyond his understanding. The figure's outstretched hand remained steady, patient, timeless, offering the cracked, ancient music box as if it were offering a crown or a noose. The shadows pulsed around it, swirling like ink dropped into water, waiting, expecting. Sister Margaret's voice trembled, raw with desperation. Don't take it. If you do, there's no coming back, no escape, no. Her words fractured into sobs, her body curling inward as if trying to shrink out of existence. Her eyes, hollow, sunken, stared into him, begging him to resist, but filled with the resignation of someone who already knew how this would end. Someone who had watched it happen before. The carpenter's hands trembled violently. The new box in his grip pulsed, warm now, almost alive, syncing with his heartbeat in a rhythm that felt both intimate and oppressive. His gaze flicked between the two, the new box, fresh and polished, and the old one, cracked and bleeding ink, whispering promises of relief, of release. But it was a lie. He knew that now. They were both the same, different faces of the same trap. The figure leaned in slightly, its faceless void shifting, bending the air around it, as though gravity itself bent to its will. Choose. The voice vibrated. Not a request, not even a command, but a demand from something older than choice itself. Hold or pass. Sing or be sung. The walls trembled under the weight of those words, as though the stone remembered every soul that had stood here before. Every choice, every failure. His vision blurred. His knees buckled. In that instant, something deep inside him, a voice not from the shadows, not from the box, but his own, whispered back, "No." And with a scream torn from the rawest part of his being, he hurled the polished box toward the ground with everything he had left. The sound of it striking the stone wasn't what on rock. It was the sound of shattering bone, and a scream that didn't end. The moment the box shattered, the chamber convulsed. A violent, sickening quake that sent cracks tearing through the floor, the walls, the ceiling. The figure recoiled violently, its form glitching, twisting inward on itself, as if the very fabric of its existence was being torn apart by the rejection, the refusal of the ritual. For the first time, the faceless void wasn't smiling. It was screaming. The melody collapsed instantly, twisting into a dissonant screech that made blood pour from the carpenter's ears, his nose, his mouth. The shadows convulsed as if poisoned. Tendrils snapped back into the earth. The glyphs floating in the air shattered like glass, releasing clouds of ash that dissolved before they touched the ground. The bones embedded in the walls rattled violently, some exploding into dust, others bursting into flames without fire. Sister Margaret collapsed entirely, her body convulsing once before going still. But her chest, it rose, fell. She was breathing, barely. Her hands weakly reached out toward the carpenter, her lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a plea. Around her, the ground split open, revealing an endless abyss beneath the monastery, a void that had been sealed for centuries, now threatening to swallow everything. The figure thrashed, its form fracturing, breaking apart into shards of shadow and fragments of noise. Its hands flailed toward the broken box, desperate, clawing, trying to reclaim what had been lost. But it was too late. The spell was undone. The voice was severed. The song had ended. But with it, the seal, the prison was unraveling too. And then, the floor gave way. A deafening roar, like the earth itself screaming, as the chamber collapsed into the abyss. The carpenter's body flew backward, weightless, air torn from his lungs as he plummeted into the darkness. Stones, bones, shadows, light, all fell together, spinning, colliding, consumed by the void. And in those final seconds, as the world above was swallowed whole, one sound echoed louder than all the rest, not a scream, not a whisper, but the faint, delicate click, click, click of a music box winding itself one last time. The fall felt endless. The void wasn't just empty space. It was thick like sinking through liquid shadow. Time distorted, stretching and collapsing in strange, nauseating waves. The carpenter tumbled through flashes of something. Not light, not images, but memories. Not his own. Faces flickered past him. Voices. Whispers. Cries of children. Laughter of the dead. Echoes of every soul that had ever been trapped here. His body jerked as he slammed against something solid. Not ground, but a surface smooth and cold like polished obsidian. Above him, nothing. Only the endless black. Below him, more of the same. But around him, walls began to form. Not made of stone, but of mirrors. Tall, towering, endless mirrors stretching into the abyss. Each one flickering, with moving reflections. None of them his. He rose slowly, trembling. The mirrors showed versions. Thousands. Millions. Versions of himself. Some screaming. Some silent. Some laughing. Some singing. And among them, faces he recognized. Sister Margaret. Dozens of her bound, broken, hollow. Father Samuel. The taken. And others strangers. Men. Women. Children. All trapped. All watching. A deep hum filled the air, vibrating through his teeth, his bones. The hum shifted, tuning itself into something recognizable, the melody. The cursed melody. But softer. Slower. As if sung from far away. A child's voice. Round and round the voices go. Where they stop, you'll never know. The rhyme was playful. Innocent. Terrifying. Behind a movement, a mirror flickered violently. Something inside it wasn't reflecting anymore. It was pushing. Hands. Fingers. Pressing against the glass from the inside. Then a face. Not his. Hollow. Skin stretched too thin. Mouth wide open in a silent scream. Its hands clawed at the surface, not trying to escape, but trying to pull him in. He stumbled backward as cracks spread across the mirror, the thing inside pushing harder. The glass bulged, warping, as though it were made of liquid. The creature's fingertips pierced through first, long, splintered, skeletal, snapping open like spider legs as they gripped the edges of reality itself. Then the mouth pushed through, a mouth with no teeth, only the hollow, endless dark, and from it a whisper, trade. His breath caught. His hands instinctively reached for his pockets. Empty. The music box was gone, ripped from him during the fall, or perhaps it had never been real. But the absence was worse than possession. Without it, he wasn't a keeper. He was prey. The creature's hands flailed wider, ripping the mirror open further. From inside, dozens of other hands reached out, some small like children, some twisted, broken, fingers bent in unnatural ways. The mirrors around him began to flicker faster. More faces appeared, more hands, more mouths. They all whispered the same word in unison, overlapping, forming a single suffocating sound that filled the air, pressing into his skin, into his lungs, into his mind. Trade, 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 a deal. An offering. A demand. He spun, looking for an exit. Anything, but the mirrors stretched in every direction, infinite. No doors. No windows. Only endless versions of himself and the others before him, all cycling through the same nightmare, caught in the same loop. Some pounding against the glass, some clawing at themselves, some staring directly at him, smiling, mouthing words he couldn't hear, but instinctively knew. It's your turn. And then, one mirror stopped flickering. Perfectly still. Solid. Inside, not a reflection. A room. Familiar. The chapel. Intact. Whole. Bathed in the warm glow of candlelight. And, standing in the center, Sister Margaret. Alive. Breathing. Her hands clasped in prayer. Her eyes, open. Clear. Human. She looked directly at him and whispered, "There is a way." Before her image could fade, her gaze darted, not at him, but behind him, and her voice cracked in a scream. Run. He didn't hesitate. His legs moved before his mind could even process the command. He sprinted toward the still mirror, the only one that wasn't writhing, screaming, or fracturing. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, louder than the cacophony of whispers that chased him from behind. The hands clawed at the air, swiping inches from his skin, fingertips grazing his shirt, leaving streaks of cold so intense it burned. The ground beneath his feet shifted, warped, stretching away from him like some cruel trick of distance, as though the more he ran, the farther the mirror became. But his focus didn't break. Not this time. Sister Margaret's face, her human face, her real face, anchored him. Her eyes, pleading, desperate, filled him with something stronger than terror, the smallest flicker of hope. The whispers turned to screams, no longer asking, demanding, "Trade, trade, trade." The walls shook violently as entire sections of mirrors exploded into shards, releasing clouds of shadow and faces half-formed, mouths shrieking without sound. Tendrils of darkness erupted from the floor, twisting around his ankles, his wrists, trying to pull him back. Each step forward felt like dragging his body through wet cement, every muscle screaming in resistance. He lunged. The mirror was close enough now to touch. His fingers stretched toward it, and it rippled, like the surface of water. Not glass, not solid, a membrane, a veil. His fingertips pierced through first, met with an icy resistance that fought him, pushing back, trying to keep him in the nightmare of reflections. His shoulder slammed into the surface. It bent, resisted, and then it broke. He fell through, gasping, spinning, collapsing onto solid ground. Stone. Cold. Real. His hands scraped against something rough, dust, dirt, cobwebs. The echoes of screaming dissolved instantly. Gone. As though someone had slammed a door on a hurricane. He coughed violently, struggling to breathe, staring upward. Candlelight. Wooden beams. Stone walls. The chapel. The real chapel. Or was it? He sat up, chest rising and falling rapidly, lungs fighting to pull air into a body that had forgotten what breathing was. His head snapped left, then right. Silence. A suffocating, perfect silence. No whispers. No shadows. No mirrors. Only the flickering light of half-melted candles and the faint scent of old incense and dust. The scent of a place abandoned, but untouched. In the center of the chapel, she stood. Sister Margaret. Her hands still clasped in prayer. Her habit torn, stained, but intact. Her skin pale but alive. Her eyes, clear, human, exhausted beyond words. Her gaze met his, and her lips trembled, parting as she whispered, "You made it." But her voice wasn't relief. It was disbelief, as though she'd never actually thought it possible. The carpenter staggered to his feet. His legs trembled under the weight of something far heavier than exhaustion. The weight of every memory, every scream, every shadow that still clung to the back of his mind. But even as his hands shook, as his vision blurred, he couldn't shake the one gnawing question. Was this real? Was this truly escape? His eyes scanned the chapel, the altar, the cracked stained glass, the worn wooden pews. Everything looked exactly as it had the night Sister Margaret disappeared, as if time had folded in on itself, as if nothing had changed. But something had, something fundamental. He could feel it, like a pressure behind his eyes, like a whisper on the edge of hearing that refused to fully die. And then, he noticed it, there, on the altar, small, delicate, familiar, a wooden box, not cracked, not broken, not aged, perfect, polished, its handle perfectly still, its lid perfectly shut. but carved into the wood, deeper than before, one single phrase, Vox Mortui, Vox Veritatis. And, as his eyes locked onto it, he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been imagination, or memory, or something worse. A single, delicate click, 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 the sound of the music box winding itself again. His pulse quickened as the soft, mechanical winding echoed in the empty chapel. That sound, innocent on the surface, but beneath it, the weight of something unspeakable, something inevitable. His gaze locked on the box, unable to look away, as though it anchored not just the room, but reality itself. Sister Margaret trembled where she stood, her hands lowering from prayer, her body visibly shaking. "No," she whispered. "Not again, not again." The carpenter took one hesitant step toward the altar. His breath came in short gasps, not because he was tired, but because every instinct screamed that the moment he touched that box, something would end, or something would begin. He glanced at Sister Margaret, whose face had gone pale, her lips moving without sound, as though praying to a God who wasn't listening anymore. The atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped. The candle flames flickered violently, stretching sideways as though blown by a wind that didn't exist. A deep vibration trembled through the stones beneath their feet. The air grew heavier, oppressive, as though the very fabric of this place recognized what was about to happen. The world itself held its breath. He reached out, slowly. His fingertips hovered just inches from the box's surface. And in that space, the faintest whisper slithered into his ears. Not spoken aloud, not carried by air, but breathed directly into his thoughts. "You were chosen, not because you are strong, but because you are hollow." The words wrapped around his mind like silk laced with poison. A vessel, waiting to be filled. Then, the lid snapped open. On its own. No hands. No movement. Just a sudden, decisive click. And from within, not music, but a voice. A voice he recognized instantly. His own. Speaking words he never remembered saying. "I accept." The blood drained from his face. His knees buckled, and the horrifying realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. The choice had already been made. The chapel trembled. Dust rained from the rafters. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stained glass, sending splinters of colored light fracturing across the walls. Sister Margaret fell to her knees, her hands pressed over her ears, her mouth open in a silent scream. The air vibrated with something that wasn't sound, but presence. A force so heavy it pressed down on their bodies, crushing the space between every heartbeat. From the box, the voice continued, still his but now layered. Multiplied. A chorus. His words, spoken by 1,000 mouths, overlapping, folding into themselves until meaning dissolved, leaving only rhythm. Only song. The melody returned. Slow. Inevitable. Sweet. Hollow. Round and round, the voices go. Shadows poured from the box like smoke, spilling across the altar, seeping into the cracks of the floor, slithering up the walls. But this time, they didn't take form. They didn't become tendrils, or figures, or watchers. They simply existed, a fog of memory, of suffering, of promises made and broken, swirling endlessly, as though the box itself now contained everything that had ever been, and everything that would ever be. His knees buckled, his hands pressed against the altar to keep from collapsing entirely. His mind split along hairline fractures as memories not his own flooded in. Faces, screams, prayers, deaths, bargains whispered in the dark, hands grasping for salvation that never came. And in the center of it all, the inescapable, undeniable truth, the voice never ends. It simply finds a new singer. Then silence. Utter, perfect silence. The box snapped shut. The shadows withdrew. The candle stabilized. The tremors stopped. Sister Margaret collapsed completely, unmoving. And in that silence, he stood. Alone. Box in hand. A vessel. A keeper. A door. His eyes drifted toward the entrance of the chapel. And, for the first time, he noticed it. Something carved deep into the wood. Words he had never seen before. Words that had always been there. Once opened, it cannot be closed. And, as the meaning sank deep into the marrow of his bones, the box in his hands began to wind itself again. The chapel stood silent once more. But it wasn't the peaceful silence of safety. It was the suffocating quiet of knowing, of understanding that some doors, once opened, never truly close. Somewhere deep beneath the floor, the echoes of voices long forgotten still murmured, waiting, watching, reminding anyone who dares listen that curiosity is often the first step toward something that cannot be undone. The carpenter stood there, box in hand, frozen between two truths. One, that he had survived something few ever had. And two, that survival came with a price. A truth now bound to him. Not a truth meant to enlighten, but one meant to trap, to ensnare, to perpetuate the cycle. Because some truths are not meant to be learned. Some truths do not set you free. They bind you. They change you. Forever. And perhaps that's the cruel lesson hidden in this nightmare. That not everything lost should be found. Not every mystery deserves an answer. And not every voice should be heard. Because when we listen too closely to the whispers buried in the dark, we sometimes forget that what's whispering might just be waiting for someone foolish enough to answer. Now, maybe the real question isn't what was inside that box, or what truly happened to Sister Margaret. The real question is, how many doors like this still exist? How many songs are still playing, unheard? How many boxes are still waiting, somewhere, in basements, in forgotten chapels, behind broken walls, winding themselves patiently for the next person curious enough to listen? And if stories like this send a chill down your spine, imagine how many others are still out there, waiting to be told, or waiting to be discovered. So if you never want to miss the next voice that rises from the shadows, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share your thoughts in the comments. After all, some doors, once opened, never truly close. And sometimes, the only way to survive them is to remember their stories.